Kim Peets and welcome to My Story, His Story. What do we know about Seventh-day Adventist church leaders and how has God influenced them? In this series we take a closer look at the lives of these Christian leaders and invite them to share their stories with us. Sitting with me is Senior Finance Administrator Kingsley Wood. Welcome, Kingsley.
Thank you, Kim.
It's so good to have you here today.
I think it's nice to be here.
You've had a really interesting childhood and I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, I remember only vaguely the very early parts, but we came from Perth in Western Australia to Warburton in Victoria, where my parents were nurses. And from there, we travelled to New Guinea, where they were to work in medical clinics in 3 different places in New Guinea.
Okay, well that sounds very interesting.
Yeah.
And whereabouts you moved around in Papua New Guinea, didn't you?
Yes, we moved from different places. We were at Madang, we were a place called Hartsveld Haven, which was a leprosarium, and then we finished up in a place called Homu, which is up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea.
Okay, and you've got some stories there that you could share with us?
Oh yes, I do. I'll give you a couple. One that comes to mind readily is when I had a bit of an incident with a gentleman. Well, no, we were kids. But we were playing one day and playing out in the yard, having a good time. And he had a bow and arrow. He had a little bow and arrow and we thought they were fun. And he gave me his bow and arrow. And I thought I'd try shooting it, which you pull it back and shoot. And I was aiming at a tree, and he was behind the tree. He thought it'd be good to be behind the tree, and I would fire at the tree, and the arrow would stick in the tree. Well, I wasn't a real good shot, obviously. He popped his head around the corner as I shot the arrow, and it ended up sticking him right in the heart area. And if any of you know anything about Papua New Guinea, or if you know about Papua New Guinea, you'll know that we do have a system up there called payback. And of course my mother was very distraught about this because it actually stuck into his flesh and it was still sticking out. Anyway, she came racing out at the sound of all the screams and the hollering, and she pulled the arrow out and she put a band-aid on it and patched it all up for him. And then in a moment of can we say, distress, she broke up the bow and arrow and buried it in the ground. I was never to touch it again. So that was quite an experience for me, being told that I shot the wrong person.
Yes, yes. And were there any repercussions?
No, there weren't any at that time. We had a good time in Papua New Guinea. We enjoyed the place. Another thing I could tell you was quite comical. My brother and I, we used to play around the grounds because we didn't have a school to go to, so a little bit of correspondence with Mum in the morning, and then we're out playing for the rest of the day.
Free time, fantastic.
Yeah. We had there was a shed which housed a generator which provided us with power, and across from the shed was a national home, and it had a peaked roof. And one day we were there running across the corrugated iron roof and jumping over the gap onto the roof of the house. And it was a sort of bouncy roof, and we thought that was great fun. And I was doing that one day, and I ran across, jumped onto the roof, and it imploded. It just imploded, the whole, like an upside down pyramid.
Oh, great.
And my brother was watching from down on the ground, and he yells out at the top of his voice, "Are you dead?" Fortunately, I was able to say, "Of course I'm alive, I'm all right." And but we got into trouble for that because it was a national home and had to be repaired.
Yes, of course. Oh my goodness me. Were there any particular highlights or anything that stands out in your mind that was sort of life-changing for you at all? In
New Guinea? I think the only thing, probably one thing that made me a little bit scared was when one day we were playing outside, as we tended to do, and I seemed to have some sort of something went wrong up here. We won't go into too much detail there, but I got to the point where when I went to eat, I would lift my hand like this and my mouth would go like that, and it was a most strange feeling, and I couldn't walk straight. My parents were very scared. They thought this was something major and didn't know what to do. They took me off down to hospital, which was several hours away to get to hospital, and over bumpy roads and a four-wheel drive. But when we arrived, I was quite normal, and so we didn't think too much more about it until we got home to Australia, many years later, or when I should say many, not many, 2 or 3 years later. And it was there that a doctor indicated that while he didn't know what it was, he thinks I had a pretty good escape.
So what was it?
We don't know. No one really knows what it was, but it was just seemed some strange little aberration that happened in my brain on that day.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And anything else that stands out in your mind?
In New Guinea, the friendliness of the people. That was really lovely. They, in those days, you could walk around quite happily. There wasn't really much problem in Papua New Guinea, and so we enjoyed that. I loved the tropical fruits, and I can still remember sitting in front of a pineapple that was probably about this high, a huge pineapple, and things like tamarillos and pawpaw and those sort of things. We had a great time.
Sounds like you had a really good time.
Enjoyed Papua New Guinea.
And it sounds like you came from a really good home.
Lovely home. Mum and Dad, very earnest Christians, and we had a very good upbringing, 6 of us, brought up in a lovely home.
Excellent. Well, some people don't always have some big life-changing event that happens in their life, is it? And I guess for your life, you could say you had a fairly great life, a good Christian upbringing, and a big family.
Yes, a good family, a really good family. I think probably the first time I sort of had a realisation that perhaps there's a higher power was when I was... we were back in Australia. We'd come back home. We relocated to Warburton, and I was riding down an avenue in Warburton, which is a very steep hill. Those of you who know Warburton, Blackwood Avenue, very steep. And at the bottom of this hill was a very sharp left-hand corner, and I was heading down that hill at quite a pace on the push bike, and I realised I wasn't going to make the corner at the end, and so I went straight ahead, hit the gutter, quite a deep gutter, which threw me off. And I I landed in such a way that my head was against a rock, quite a big rock, about as big as that. And I got up and had a look, and I thought, man alive, I've stopped here. My head's on this rock. I have not a single injury, and I thought, I think somebody's looking after me. My parents made it a habit every morning to commit us all to God, and we had morning worship, evening worship, and prayed for safety of us all.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Kingsley. Stay with us after this break and we'll hear more from Kingsley Wood. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I'm talking with Senior Administrator Kingsley Wood. Kingsley, it sounds like you had a really good upbringing, like a happy upbringing, living in Papua New Guinea and moving around the place with your parents who were dedicated nurses. And now you're a senior administrator, you've been an accountant, you've done all sorts of roles. You worked in Australia and overseas. Is this where you always thought you'd be?
No, not really. In fact, for me, I didn't have a real vision of what I wanted to do or where I wanted to end up eventually, except that as I was reading some books by Dr. Paul White, who wrote a lot of books, and we used to call them the Jungle Doctor stories. Okay. And as I read those stories of his experiences in Africa, I really wanted to be a doctor. Just that was my focus. And the more I read the stories, the more I wanted to be a doctor, and so that's what I focused on. It didn't quite work out that way.
What happened?
It's called grades. When I went to high school, I took subjects, obviously, in some of the basics, mathematics, English, and I took physics and chemistry. And at the end of what is now year 10, my physics and chemistry grades were fairly dismal.
And pretty important to have if you're going to be a doctor.
Precisely. I then thought, look, it's not for me. It seems as though that was not going to be something that I was going to shine enough in to be able to get into university and do doctoral work. So I took the next thing which I thought would be interesting, and that was accounting and economics instead of chemistry and physics. And I did very well at those two subjects. In fact, it was because of those two subjects that I was able to gain a scholarship to get into a business course. And so that's the area I headed. That's the way where I headed.
Okay, and along the way, was there some inspiration or some inspiring moments?
Not particularly. I used to work as a kitchen hand at a hospital. I enjoyed that work very much. I loved serving people. That's one thing I did do, and I think that's why I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to serve people. And I guess I hadn't even thought of finance at all. I hadn't thought about business as serving people, but the more I thought about that, and the more I thought about going to college and doing business, I thought, well, maybe I can serve, even if it's in perhaps what I considered a lesser role.
Okay, but you've done so many things, and
oh yes, yes, yeah. You still do many things, and of course I keep hobbies, music being my biggest hobby. But yeah, no, I've been to many places either for the church, working in a financial capacity, including places like Fiji, which was an enjoyable experience. Yes.
And has there been anyone in particular who's been a mentor for you and really helped you along the way?
Yes, there has been. At our senior office in Sydney, my immediate boss was Mr. Owen Mason, and I've got to say that he was an excellent mentor for me. Very encouraging, very affirming, and it wasn't just to me but to all those who came through in the business line. He took a very special interest in, worked with us, we played sports together, you know, we really did value him as a valuable mentor.
And Kingsley, you mentioned some hobbies. What sort of hobbies have you got?
Well, apart from music, I also used to play squash a lot. My mentor Owen we used to play 2 or 3 times a week, and that was fantastic. I don't play so much now, as you can probably tell, but it was enjoyable. The other hobby I really like is motorbike riding, and I've done that for many years now and still do. Unfortunately, motorbike riding comes with a little bit of a risk. And I've had a brother and a brother-in-law who have unfortunately died as a result of motorcycle accidents.
What happened to your brother?
My brother was actually a pillion passenger on a bike, and he was travelling with a friend north in Australia, and they came round a corner and couldn't take the corner, going a little bit too fast probably, and hit a vehicle, and he was thrown off and he died.
And how did that affect you and your family, and did it shatter your faith?
No, it didn't shatter my faith, but it certainly, I think it welded us as a family. He was perhaps a person who had probably left God a little bit, and so we were always concerned for his well-being, and I guess it welded us as a family in a lot of ways, but of course very sad occasion, as deaths always are, but for one so young, only 17.
That must have been really hard for you, but yet you're sitting here and you're in service and working for God.
Yes,
as
absolutely.
An accountant.
As an accountant, I know there are some people who think that accountants would have to be one of the most boring jobs. You've heard unfortunate terms like bean counters. We're not all like that. No, I find accounting a challenge. And in the same way that I was mentored to very much by Owen, as I mentioned before, I hope that I can be a mentor to those that I come in contact with. We have a number of young accountants who come through our office, and I meet quite a few of them from time to time across Australia, and we're very interested in each one of them. And I just hope that in some way I can also mentor them, not only in the discipline of accounting, but also in spiritual matters as well.
So I guess you could say that work's like a hobby for you.
It is, yeah. You've heard the old adage, you know, happy is the man whose work is his hobby. Or it might be the other way around, whose hobby is his work. I see work as a bit of a hobby. Some people call me a workaholic. I don't see that way at all. I enjoy the work and just I think do my best.
And have you got any words of advice for those that might be feeling like accounting might be their call, and they're possibly saying it can't be a call, it's not what God would want me to do?
Oh, look, I think it is a calling. It's ministry. It's certainly in a different area. It's a service type of industry as opposed to perhaps taking the gospel directly to somebody. But it still is very much a service. And from that point of view, we can act in just as Christ-like a manner in the way that we do business as we do in our church services.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kingsley. Stay with us after this break and we'll hear more from Kingsley Wood. Welcome back to My Story, His Story. I've been talking with Senior Finance Administrator, Mr. Kingsley Wood. Kingsley, it's been great to talk to you about your story, about your upbringing in Papua New Guinea and all the different stories that you had, and going from wanting to be a doctor to being an accountant, and the interesting story that happened there. And you also touched a little bit on music, but I'm thinking here, music, accountant, it doesn't seem to kind of connect in any way. So why is that so important for you?
Interesting you should say that, Kim. Some people call accountants very creative.
Well, that's true.
You're suggesting they're not. Perhaps creative in other ways in the accounting arena. But music has been a love of my life for as long as I can remember. However, I didn't ever see it as a career. But I have used it in church for all of my life that I can remember. And I find that music is something that I really enjoy, and I've been able to be fortunate enough to combine music in my church, in my local church and community, as much as I use my accounting. And I see it very much as a ministry. Music to me is very important in the life of the church. And I wish there was more of it, personally. But I certainly make the best of it when I can.
Well, it's great because you can combine the best of two worlds, isn't it?
That's right.
Now, tell us a little bit about your favourite Bible character.
Well, of course, there are many.
Yes.
And we could choose any number of them. But one person that I really look up to and value, and I guess consider as a mentor in some ways, is Joshua. Joshua was a strong man. In fact, Joshua and a friend of his, I guess, Caleb, they were the only two men who moved into Israel, into the new land, the promised land of Canaan, from the original group that left Egypt.
Because they were wandering for how many years?
Well, something like 40 years. It might have even been a little longer, I think. But they were the last ones, and they were the only ones who actually crossed over into that land. When Moses died, because he was the great leader and took the children of Israel out of Egypt, when he died, he was told to hand over the leadership. Well, I guess it was before he died, to hand over leadership to Joshua. And we know very little of Joshua's early years, but we know certainly of his years as he became the leader of the children of Israel. And it was actually Joshua who took the children of Israel across the River Jordan and into this wonderful promised land that they were all looking forward to so much. Joshua was a strong, courageous man. And many times in the Bible, in the story of Joshua, if you look at the book in the Bible called Joshua, which is his story, you'll find that he is often told by God to be strong, to be courageous, to not get discouraged. And so often in life it's easy for us to be discouraged, to not be fearful. And again, there are so many times in our work life, in our church life, in our home life where we are fearful. But he was told not to be those things. And one of the hardest things, I think, is not to get discouraged, because there are things that you hate about life in general. Not that you want to end it, but you hate about it, you know, things you don't like. And they get you down sometimes. And God continually encouraged Joshua not to be discouraged. I think of some stories of Joshua, you know, when he went into the promised land and he began conquering the cities and the nations around. Very strong man, led his people and was directed by God himself in that endeavour.
And it was some of the hardest pieces of land to conquer, wasn't it?
Oh yes, very difficult. He also had the job to distribute the land of Israel to the 12 different tribes. And so he allocated the land to these tribes, and then he helped to fight off those tribes so that they could actually occupy. And it's interesting that even in his old age, he took the hardest territory. He left the easier territories for other tribes, but he and his tribe took the hardest one.
You mentioned that Joshua led the Israelites into Canaan. Was there a particular battle that was noteworthy?
Oh, I think the first one they had was very noteworthy. It was the Battle of Jericho.
Okay.
Some of you may know the song, Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho. In other words, he fought the Battle of Jericho, which is a very important battle for them. Their first city that they needed to conquer, and it was quite an incredible way that they conquered it. In fact, God always went before them. God led them in the way that they were to fight. And in fact, this particular experience wasn't really a fight at all. It was an experience of tramping around the city a few times and then making a great big noise, and the walls fell down. It sounds an incredible story, but once again it was showing the leading of God in the life of this man and the life of the Israelites. Yeah.
He was quite a courageous man, wasn't he?
Extremely, yeah. I find that Joshua, during the course of in the book, Joshua, on two specific occasions, it mentions that he renewed the covenant with the people. Now, covenant for us would be like an agreement, almost like a legal agreement that you have with somebody. So God would do something for them and they would do something for God. Sort of like a legal covenant or a legal agreement. And twice Joshua renewed that covenant with the people of Israel. It was very important back then. And in fact, as you read the book, you find that Joshua, throughout the whole history of Joshua's leadership, the people followed God the whole time. So clearly Joshua had an ability to keep these people on track as it comes to serving God. Joshua also must have had a fantastic relationship with God, because on one occasion in one battle, he implored God. He said, God, please stop the sun. Don't let it go down until we finish this battle. And that's exactly what happened. And it's interesting, whoever wrote the book says in the book, and to this day, since then and to this day, no one has ever been able to be listened to by God in the same way.
God stopped time just for Joshua.
And just a fantastic thing. Yeah.
And how has Joshua influenced your life?
Well, I take from Joshua the fact that he was so strong in the Lord. And I want to be strong in the Lord. I try and emulate people like Joshua and others in the Bible who were great leaders. Not that I aspire necessarily to be a hero, no, but I do want to do the best I can, and for God, for his church. And so I like the fact that Joshua, his integrity comes through in the book, his courage. He doesn't get discouraged. He does let God lead, and those are the things that encourage me.
Excellent, excellent. And do you have anything that you would like to read for us from the Bible?
Well, look, the text that comes to mind is found in the last book of Joshua when he's dying. He's called the people together again once more, his leaders, and he's talking to them about keeping their faith and keeping true to God. And he says, look, you followed gods from the river, from Egypt. You followed those sort of gods in your past. But now, if following God, my God, doesn't seem good to you, then choose which one of those. But as for me, he says, as for me and my house, I am going to serve the Lord, or we are going to serve the Lord. And I would encourage everybody to serve the Lord, and that's what I want to do.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Kingsley.
Pleasure.
Being nice to hear your stories. Thank you so much for joining us on My Story, His Story, and we hope you join us again next time.